on May the 14th. Just forgetting what date it was. I think Srila Prabhupada once said that, what was it, if you don't know what day it is. Anyway, he had something interesting to say. Anyway, welcome to the Srimad Bhagavatam class here in Dublin on May the 14th. And we will start by chanting a little Jai Radha Madhava. Hare Krishna. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivardhari. Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivardhari. Yashoda Nandana Chajannaranjana. Yashoda Nandana Bhaja Janaranjana. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Jaya Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivardhari. Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivardhari. Yashoda Nandana Braja Janaranjana. Yashoda Nandana Braja Janaranjana. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivardhari. Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivardhari. Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana. Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana. Jamuna Tira Vanachari. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Hare Krishna. Just before I start class, if I could just mention that one devotee friend that I know from the Hare Krishna community in near Milan, near Bergamo in northern Italy, Villaggio Hare Krishna is the name of the temple or the name of the center there. I'm sure many of you have been there. Beautiful place actually, and beautiful deities, Shishi Radha Raman, and lovely community, nice big community, many devotees. But one devotee there, Shamananda Prabhu, is currently suffering bad from COVID-19 and is in the hospital. And as of now, it's not looking great for him. But as I say, if the devotees' prayers are very powerful. I think we talked about the power of prayer in a previous talk. So, if you can say, even if you don't know him actually, very nice devotee. Shamananda Prabhu, say a little prayer for him. Hare Krishna, thank you. A reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 13, Dhritarashtra quits home. We've been on this chapter now. This is verse 30 today, so we've been on this chapter for 30 verses. So we're continuing with that. Text 30. Patim prayantam subalasha putri pativrata pativrata janujagama sadvi himalayam nyastadanda prahasham manasvinam samprahara patim prayantam subalasha putri pativrata janujagama sadvi himalayam nyastadanda prahasham manasvinami vasatsam prahara patim prayantam subalasha putri pativrata janujagama sadvi himalayam nyastadanda prahasham manasvinam iva satsam prahara patim prayantam subalasha putri pativrata janujagama sadvi himalayam nyastadanda prahasham manasvinam iva satsam prahara. Patim, her husband. Prayantam, while leaving home. Subalasya, of King Subal. Putri, the worthy daughter. Pativrata, devoted to her husband. Cha, also. Anujagama, followed. Sadvi, the chaste. Himalayam, toward the Himalaya mountains. Nyastadanda, one who has accepted the rod of the renounced order. Prahasham, object of delight. Manasvinam, of the great fighters. Eva, like. Sat, legitimate. Sampraha, good lashing. Translation. The gentle and chaste Gandhari, who was the daughter of King Subal of Kandahar or Gandhara, followed her husband, seeing that he was going to the Himalaya mountains, which are the delight of those who have accepted the staff of the renounced order, like fighters who have accepted a good lashing from the enemy. Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, Srila Prabhupada. Salbalini, or Gandhari, daughter of King Subal and wife of King Dhritarashtra, was ideal as a wife devoted to her husband. The Vedic civilization especially prepares chaste and devoted wives, of whom Gandhari is one amongst many mentioned in history. Lakshmiji Sita Devi was also a daughter of a great king, but she followed her husband, Lord Ramchandra, into the forest. Similarly, as a woman, Gandhari could have remained at home or at her father's house, but as a chaste and gentle lady, she followed her husband without consideration. Instructions for the renounced order of life were imparted to Dhritarashtra by Vidura, and Gandhari was by the side of her husband. But he did not ask her to follow him, because he was at that time fully determined, like a great warrior who faces all kinds of dangers in the battlefield. He was no longer attached to so-called wife or relatives, and he decided to start alone. But as a chaste lady, Gandhari decided to follow her husband till the last moment. Maharaj Dhritarashtra accepted the order of Vanaprast, and at this stage the wife is allowed to remain as a voluntary servitor. But in the sannyas stage, no wife can stay with her former husband. A sannyasi is considered to be a dead man civilly, and therefore the wife becomes a civil widow without connection with her former husband. Maharaj Dhritarashtra did not deny his faithful wife, and she followed her husband at her own risk. The sannyasis accept a rod as the sign of the renounced order of life. There are two types of sannyasis. Those who follow the Mayavad philosophy, headed by Sripad Sankaracharya, accept only one rod, Ekadanda. But those who follow the Vaishnav philosophy accept three combined rods, Tridanda. The Mayavadi sannyasis are Ekadandi Swamis, whereas the Vaishnav sannyasis are known as Tridandi Swamis, or more distinctly, Tridandi Goswamis, in order to be distinguished from the Mayavadi philosophers. The Ekadandi Swamis are mostly fond of the Himalayas, but the Vaishnav sannyasis are fond of Vrindavan and Puri. The Vaishnav sannyasis are Narottamas, or Nartamas, whereas the Mayavad sannyasis are Dhiras. Maharaj Dhritarashtra was advised to follow the Dhiras because at that stage it was difficult for him to become a Narottama. Translation again. The gentle and chaste Gandhari, who was the daughter of King Subal of Kandahar, or Gandhara, followed her husband, seeing that he was going to the Himalaya mountains, which are the delight of those who have accepted the staff of the renounced order, like fighters who have accepted a good lashing from the enemy. Om Ajana Tamarandasha Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayarupagadamayam Dadati Swa Patantikam. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktavrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Rama Rama, Hari Hari. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Rama Rama, Hari Hari. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Rama Rama, Hari Hari. The translation, just interesting that the Himalaya mountains, or Himalaya mountains as we tend to call them, it states that they are the delight of those who have accepted the staff of the renounced order, so the renounced stage of life, sannyas. And it's interesting that if you think of expeditions to the Himalaya mountains, even today, of course they're trying to get right to the very top, but still, even the base camp is freezing cold, and there's no facilities there, and it's all very, of course they bring facilities and all of that, but in essence there's no facilities there, and it's a very tough place to be and to exist. So it's interesting that for those in the renounced order of life, those who have given up all those social comforts and social niceties, the Himalayas mountains, that they're like delight for them, because they're so austere and such a difficult place to exist in. So this is, although this is directly for people in the renounced order of life or renounced stage of life, it's still very educational for all of us that at some point we have to give up the niceties and the comfortable facilities that we currently avail of here in the material world, because at the time of death they're taken away and we have no choice in that matter. And that's of course the reason why we go through these different stages of life, culminating in the sannyas stage, because it's a training process, a learning process, an educational process, to get us to that point where we're more prepared for all of those facilities and comforts to be taken away. And you know, it is actually very logical when you think about it. If you right up to your dying day are just surrounded by, you know, every possible convenience and comfort like that, it's going to be more difficult when you have to leave it all in one fell swoop, one go. That's going to be very challenging. Whereas if you kind of gradually prepare yourself for that, you know, renouncing different things as you progress through life, then when it comes to the point of leaving this world, you'll already have renounced many of those things, and it just makes it so much easier. So it's actually quite a common sense, logical thing for us to do. I was also struck in the actual Sanskrit where it talks about, or it uses the word sadvi, and it translates sadvi as chaste in relation to Gandhari. But of course, sadvi is the female version of the word sadhu, or saintly person. So Gandhari here, due to her chastity, her being chaste, but also due to her loyalty and commitment to her vows, she's very much displaying the mood of a saintly person or of a sadhu. Also interesting, just historically, that she came from, and her name Gandhari is after Gandhara, or as is described here, Kandahar, which of course is in modern day Afghanistan. So it's interesting that it's, well, two things that are interesting, I guess, is one it's indicating that Bharatvarsh, or what we know as modern day India, was once the whole world was governed from that area. So Gandhari coming from there, it wouldn't have been considered that she wasn't, you know, part of Bharatvarsh. It was Bharatvarsh at that time, but it's just interesting now how at the time of the Kurukshetra war, and you know, the world effectively broke up into different kingdoms and wasn't being all governed from one place, Bharatvarsh or modern day India. And then the other thing that's kind of interesting is that, you know, she's coming from a kind of Kshatriya place, you know, a warrior place. And interesting also in the translation that it's describing that, you know, Kshatriyas, well, it's describing people in the renounced order, that they're relishing these austerities like fighters or warriors who have accepted a good lashing from the enemy. So that's also kind of interesting that, you know, if by nature that's your varna, that you're a Kshatriya, then you're welcoming this, you know, being lashed by the enemy. It's something that you're welcoming like that. But anyway, it's interesting that's the area where Gandhari hailed from. Anyway, so at this stage, I think a few verses prior to the one we're reading today, Vidura, who has been, you know, trying to convince Dhritarashtra to leave home, going back to that first point, that rather than, there was two problems there. One, he was staying and living like a king, so he was surrounded by all those comforts, which were not going to help him. He was an very old man at this stage, so they were not going to help him in terms of whenever he got to the point of leaving this world. And then in addition, he wasn't even living from his own means as such. He was sort of dependent on others like that. So for those reasons, Vidura had been, you know, really, really encouraging him to leave and to head north, head to the Himalayas like that. And now, because of Vidura was a pure soul and a selfless soul, and he wasn't doing this out of malice or anything like that, he was doing it out of the best interests of Dhritarashtra. He now has become successful. His preaching, his coaxing, his coaching has proved successful, and Dhritarashtra is doing the right thing, and he's become convinced. And of course, once he becomes convinced, this is an interesting thing for all of us, I guess, that once you become convinced about something, there's no longer any need to consider it or think about it or whatever. once you become convinced, you act on that immediately. So Dhritarashtra now was acting on it immediately, and he left home and was heading north. But then this, also this example, then he was heading. He had now become convinced, so he was heading north immediately. He wasn't thinking about this anymore, and he was just now fixed on that and set in his ways, if you like, and he was doing it. And whether he even gave a thought to his wife being with him or not, he certainly, that wasn't something that was going to change his mind. He was going regardless. But then Gandhari, as a loving and faithful wife, her mood was to follow her husband unconditionally, and that's exactly what she did. And in our modern world, actually, the actions of Gandhari are often viewed as they're often viewed as kind of weak or even primitive, when the very opposite is in reality the case. Yeah, it's interesting, in this sense, she's being described as a sadhu, and much of that is on the basis of her loyalty and chastity, etc. But yet, in our modern world, women who are in that, who follow that path, yeah, somehow or other they're almost seen as second or even third class citizens like that. And there's not one nice kind of short story that kind of illustrates that point. A little story, little anecdote, that once there was a hunter, and the hunter, he was practicing his shooting. Like I guess anybody involved in any kind of activity, practice makes perfect. So he was practicing his shooting, and he took some birds who were, he had in baskets or whatever, and he released them, and of course, released them to shoot them like that. And of course, once you release birds, generally speaking, once you release birds like that, they all just fly away, immediately fly away like that. And if their freedom, their liberty, and they just want to, fly away. So, and then of course, the hunter takes out his gun. Of course, modern day now, hopefully, that they use clay pigeons like that. But the principle's the same, the birds are flying away, and then you shoot to see, and because it's a moving target, so it's harder to hit them, etc. So you're really honing your skills, So that's what he did. They all flew away. He shoots, and he shoots them all down dead. He was already a pretty good shot. So he shoots them all down dead. But one of the birds, just one, when he opened those baskets, instead of flying away, that bird just literally jumped down at the feet of the shooter, of the hunter. And by that way, they were protected, because the shooter was, the hunter was looking up to shoot all the birds that were flying away, but this one didn't fly away, just went down to the hunter's feet. And as a result of that, they didn't get killed, they were protected. And the analogy is that similarly, if we take shelter, instead of flying away from Krishna and trying to run away from Krishna, we take shelter of Krishna. Because if we run away from Krishna, we'll get shot down, not by a hunter, or by a hunter if you like, but by Maya. We get shot down by Maya. So instead of trying to do that, if we fly to Krishna's feet and take shelter of his lotus feet, then Maya cannot touch us. It was interesting. I read a story the other day. Amazing, some of these stories. But anyway, the story was that two lady devotees, it was in Russia, two lady devotees, they were at some program, some festival, they were doing something, I can't remember exactly. And afterwards they had to fly back from wherever the festival was, they had to fly back to their, I don't think this happened recently as such, maybe it was a year ago, 2 years ago, I think it was pre-COVID, but anyway, they were at this festival doing whatever they were doing. The festival's over and they had to fly back to their hometown. So when they got on the plane, to fly home, or just before they got on the plane, but whatever they were doing at the festival, they were maybe doing some Bharatanatyam dancing, or they were engaged in some kind of activity. The devotees who organised the festival, they gave them a nice big bag of prasadam, because I know myself personally from travelling, it's always nice to have some prasadam if it's a longish flight on the way home like that. So they had a big bag of prasadam, got on the plane, and as soon as you get to the stage where you can take your seatbelt off like that and you're sort of relaxed a little bit, they took out the bag of prasadam and they were going to honour the prasadam. And there was a gentleman sitting beside them. So naturally actually now I'm thinking of another story when I went to India myself. Oh gosh, this must have been at least 20 years, no maybe not, maybe between 15 and 20 years ago. And my wonderful wife had also done that for me. She'd cooked some really nice prasadam. It was like some finger foods, you know, like kachoris or samosas maybe, or puris as well, I think. And she made me a big, you know, avocado dip, you know, nicely spiced or whatever, you know, you dip it in it. Anyway, I flew actually from Dublin to London first, and then I got on a British Airways flight from British Airways all the way to Calcutta, direct flight. Direct flights are always best like that. So when I got on the plane in Heathrow and got on and sat down, I noticed some devotees, and then I started looking around the plane, and there must have been about 15 devotees on the plane. It was loaded, which is a wonderful thing. At least I find it a wonderful thing, because it always means that you're going to be, or you know, generally you're going to be safe. You know, Krishna may not consider me on my own so important, and the plane may go down. But I think when you've got another 15 Vaishnavas and Vaishnavis on the plane, then you know, you're quite safe. So, of course, then I'm taking my prasadam and I'm thinking, gosh, you know, I'm going to have to offer the devotees some prasadam. So I went around each of them, you know. I remember Brahma Harta Prabhu was on that flight, Varinda Sarup Prabhu was on that flight, and Mahaduti Maharaj now, I think, was on that flight. So there was lots of devotees on it. And, of course, every single one of them wanted some prasadam, so, so I was rationing it out so I'd at least be left with a little bit when I get back to my seat. And then when I got back to my seat, I was in an aisle seat, and then across the aisle, directly across from me, there was a young lady in that seat. And just as I sat back in my seat to then have my remaining, you know, a little bit of puri, you know, half a kachori or whatever it was, and a little scrapings of the avocado dip in the container. Oh, life's funny. So just as I was getting to do that, to take the remaining bit of the prasadam, this young lady said to me, oh, I was dressed in devotional clothes, and most of the devotees were as well. And she just said to me, oh, what were you doing there? What was happening? And I said, oh, and then I just explained, you know, that we're vegetarian, and, you know, we don't generally eat the airplane food, or at least, you know, prefer to take our own if we can. And explained my wife had prepared this nice prasadam. And but then I saw I had some friends on the plane, you know, and I decided that I would, you know, offer them some. So anyway, I just went into that, you know, and then I you know, instinctively said, it's just so natural, because in one sense, anyway, that's another discussion. In one sense, sharing with the devotee that they've had lots of prasadam in their life, you know, still nice to share, of course, but of course this lady probably never has. And so then instinctively I said, would you like to try some? And of course she said yes. So that was it. My very last remnants of the prasadam, you know, went to this young lady. But it was actually very interesting, because first off, she really enjoyed it. She thought it was absolutely delicious. So that's always really good. But then she asked me, you know, because we were dressed like this, you know, who were we, you know? So that was clear that she'd never heard or seen the Hare Krishnas before. And of course, she said the classic line, the absolutely classic line, are you Buddhists? And then I said no, and I explained we were Hare Krishnas, and explained who the Hare Krishnas were. That flight was a 9-hour flight, London Heathrow. And then just to mention, I asked her who she was. And she also had friends on the plane, interestingly enough. She was from a Sunday school in either Chicago or Detroit, I'm not sure, in the US. And they were all going to Calcutta to do some service in Mother Teresa's mission in Calcutta, like that. But it was interesting. I had a 9-hour flight, and I was just talking to her the whole way over, and it was all on the subject of Krishna consciousness. She was fascinated. First off, I was a little fascinated that she'd never even heard or seen them. She was about 20, something like that, that she'd never heard or seen the Hare Krishnas before. So that was kind of fascinating for me. But anyway, yeah, she was asking all questions, and it was just really, really nice. And then the really interesting thing was, as we were coming into Calcutta, which has happened to me a few times, although this was the worst example of it, we hit some really bad turbulence. You know, that turbulence where the plane suddenly feels like it's dropping, I don't know, 500 meters in 10 seconds, you know, and your stomach turns upside down, you know. But it was a really, really bad one. And the vast majority of people, including that girl, had their sick bags out, and some of them were throwing up, etc. in those situations, I always look at the cabin crew and I want to see what the cabin crew, is this something that they've experienced before that, ultimately isn't a big deal. It just feels very uncomfortable. But everyone was strapped in and the whole thing. But I remember because I've been talking about Krishna and talking about not being the body for the last sort of 6-7 hours with this lady, that when we hit this turbulence, it was really funny. I was thinking, gosh, I was totally freaked out as well, of course, but I was thinking, God, I got to keep my cool here, I've just been telling this girl all the way over, we're not the body, blah, blah, blah. So I had to took out my beads, had my beads out anyway, but, chanting, I was trying to remain as calm as I possibly could. Anyway, we all landed safely in the end, but it was quite an extraordinary thing. So, sorry for that diversion. These two ladies from Russia, they offered this gentleman some prasadam. And this gentleman said no. And he was very gruff and rough in his response, But of course that almost made them more determined, or this gentleman, he'd really benefit from getting some prasadam. So they kept on persisting, and then I won't go on for too long. So the conclusion of the story was, and eventually the man did take some prasadam. He was also at some seminar or some business meeting or something, and he was a vegetarian. Really interesting. So he hadn't eaten all day pretty much, because the only food that was on offer was all meat based like that. So then you would think, well, why was he so initially, no, I don't want any, and was quite gruff about it? And it turns out he was a devotee, and he'd been with the devotees, and then had a loss of faith, whatever. I'm not sure the exact reasons why he had stopped associating with devotees 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever it was. But then his reason for saying no was really interesting. He said, this Krishna, he just won't leave me alone. This is at least, since I've left the Hare Krishna movement, this is at least the 5th time that something like this has happened. Different every time, but along the same lines, where it seems like Krishna's following me and he's trying to, bring me back. So it's either this reason, that reason. Now today it's prasadam and I can't resist. I want to resist, but I can't because I'm starving. And I know how delicious prasadam is. So ultimately, I want to resist, but now I'm going to give in because I really need to eat something, and I know how delicious it is, etc., etc. So they gave him some prasadam, he ate it, and it was delicious, and he really appreciated it, etc., etc. So amazing, So we think of, Krishna saying in the Bhagavad Gita that, his devotee is never vanquished. So once you've engaged in devotional service, Krishna, the moral or purport of that story at least is that Krishna's never going to forsake you, and he will seek you out, and he will help you and bring you back like that. So it was quite an amazing story. That story then about the birds flying, it's kind of like this bird flew to the hunter's feet. So that's what we should do. We always try to seek Krishna's lotus feet. And even if we don't, if we've chanted Hare Krishna and engaged in Krishna's service, he's so kind that he will, if we're reluctant, he will encourage us, just like that gentleman on the airplane. So here we are talking again about, and I want to focus a little on Gandhari because of her incredible loyalty and dedication to her husband. And again, that point about in our modern life, it kind of seems like her choices were somewhat kind of primitive. So I also remember, many years ago, actually, this is a long time ago, I'm not sure exactly, but, a good few decades ago, could be as many as 30 years ago, or even more. Anyway, it was the Late Late Show, which is a famous show here in Ireland. I think it's the longest running show of its kind in the world. There used to be one in America, but I think it's longer than that now. So the Late Late Show, some of you will, the Irish devotees will certainly have known and heard. The devotees have been on the Late Late Show a couple of times actually. So anyway, there was this. It was on one evening, and the host, Gay Byrne, the original host and the most famous person, I guess, for hosting that show, he was interviewing a man called Mark Tully, and Mark Tully had been the BBC correspondent for India for I think something like 30 years or more, but he'd been their India correspondent for a long, long time, and he knew India very well. He had lived there and all of that kind of thing, So he's being interviewed, and somehow or another, he got onto the subject of death and got onto the subject of sati rites. And I'm not sure exactly the context, but he got onto the whole thing, sati rites, where a wife will follow her husband into the funeral pyre when the husband dies, like that. Of course, I think that's illegal in India now, and of course it's a complex subject because you can't have it happening where there's social pressure for the wife to do that, when she actually doesn't want to do it. The whole thing here with Gandhari, the example is she wanted to follow her husband to the Himalayas. It's not that anyone was telling her to do it or the husband was insisting she do it. No, it was completely voluntary. So in that context, voluntary sati rites are one thing, but once a culture is there for that, then there can be social pressure to do it, and of course that really isn't right, and that's why I think it's illegal now in India, in some states at least. I'm not 100% sure. Anyway, Mark Tully had got onto this subject, and he was explaining to Gay Byrne the whole funeral ceremony and how they make the funeral pyres out of wood. You're actually seeing it now happening again quite a lot because of the whole COVID problem in India. But he was talking like that. They build a pyre and then they put them out, particularly in certain places. They put them on the sacred rivers, the Ganges, Yamuna, etc., like that. And they light them, and then they float out into the river, and the body is burned like that, etc. So he was explaining this, and of course he'd been there and lived there for many, many years, so he was very appreciative actually of the Indian culture, which is essentially the remnants of the Vedic culture. And just as he got to the point where, he was explaining about the pyre is lit and then pushed out onto the river like that, Gay Byrne jumped in with his size 15 shoes, boots, and he had a different, view of all of this, but he jumped in and he says, and then they incinerate them, and he had this kind of grimace on his face as he was saying it, disapproving kind of look on his face as he was saying that, when they incinerate them. And Mark Tully immediately stopped him and looked at him in a very grave way. In other words, and he was chastised him in essence, because Gay Byrne was his comment was indicating, this is primitive, this is whatever. And Mark Tully really it chastised him and says, nothing to do with incineration. This is cremation, and it's a very glorious and beautiful ceremony that takes place. So I just thought that was very interesting, that someone, it's kind of like if you've had experience of something and you can see it, and even if it's not entirely pure and perfect, you can see where it's coming from and what the intent is, and that it came from, kind of a pure place like that. So, but Gay Byrne was seeing it completely differently. He was in some kind of like primitive culture, etc., etc. But Mark Tully really chastised him, so it was quite interesting. So this verse in purport, it's touching on that whole system of Varnashram, and as I said, mentioning how the Kshatriya is like nothing more than a good lashing from the enemy. And just like Gay Byrne was misinterpreting the funeral cremation ceremonies in India, as I just explained, similar with Varnashram, it's now completely misunderstood the world over, actually, completely misunderstood. And it's equated with the caste system, which is the polar opposite of what the Varnashram system is, because the Varnashram system, very simply, Varna and Ashram. So there's 4 ashrams, 4 Varnas. So the 4 Varnas are, I was going to say the four ashrams there. The 4 Varnas are Sudra, working people and skills, carpenters and all that kind of stuff. The working group. Then you have the Vaishyas, or the business group, farmers, that group. Then you have the Kshatriyas, the warrior class, politicians, warriors, and of course you can argue that politicians are not warriors, but historically that those two would be connected like that. So politician, warriors. And then the final one is the teaching Brahminical class, which is like the teachers and the priests and all of that kind of thing. And then the 4 ashrams, Brahmacharya, student life ashram, Grihastha ashram, which is my own ashram, which is married life, Vanaprast, where you retire from married life, but you're still with your family and with your wife, etc. And then sannyas, as we discussed, where that's the renounced order. So the purport here is talking about Gandhari as the ideal wife, which he most certainly was. But just to mention, there's many places in the Srimad Bhagavatam where it talks about the qualities of an ideal husband. You know, the Lord instructing that, you know, one who accepts a wife must be a faithful husband. So that's the first thing, and give his wife total protection, complete protection, total protection. And how human society is kind of broken into two classes of men: those who strictly follow these religious principles, the devotees like that, and you know, the classic example, best example, would be Lord Ramchandra, who, you know, as king in Vedic times, because polygamy was a completely a normal and accepted thing, particularly for the Kshatriya class and particularly for the king. So he could have had many wives, but he didn't. He took a vow to set that example, to Ekapatni, to just have one wife like that. And of course that instruction is even more important and more valid in the age we live in, because at least in bygone ages, and particularly for kings, and even now I guess for really, you know, people like that, kings who have lots of wealth, etc., they can provide for all of their wives and protect them properly, etc. But nowadays, you know, for most people that's just pie in the sky. So he was setting that example to provide all facility like that, and to give absolute protection, and just to be faithful to one wife. So there's many examples throughout the Srimad Bhagavatam about ideal family life. Ideal family life and how it all works like that. So it's not just one-sided. It's not just that the wife is expected to be ideal, but that the husband somehow or another doesn't have to be. And then lastly in the purport, it's discussing the different traditions of sannyas, and the ideal sannyas being a Narottama, a perfect devotee. And there are 4 stages of sannyas. There's Kutichak, Bahudak, Parivrajacharya and Paramahamsa. They're the 4 stages. And this Paramahamsa stage is the stage where, you know, the perfect stage, and all of those on the Paramahamsa platform would qualify as Narottams, or first-class devotees. They're described as being first-class human beings, first-class devotees. And the main kind of qualification for that, being a first-class devotee, is just being completely dependent on the mercy and the grace, if you like, of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. You're not making any other arrangements. You are literally just depending on whatever the Lord provides. And once and you're completely free from any tint or hint of sinful activity or sinful life. And as I say, just completely dependent on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So in this part here, we're seeing that Dhritarashtra was being advised by Vidura to at least become a Dhira, or someone who is constantly endeavouring for self-realisation and basically rising to the platform of Narottam. And of course, no better way in one sense to do that than to be going to the Himalayan mountains, as we discussed earlier. And that Dhira stage alone is also only attained after, you know, prolonged practice of the yoga system. But in this particular case, because of the mercy of Vidura, a great devotee of the Lord, Dhritarashtra was actually, you know, put to that stage straight away, and which is, as already mentioned, is the preparatory stage for sannyas. And of course, sannyas, then you go Kutichak, etc., Bahudak, Parivrajacharya, Paramahamsa, and then you have reached the Narottama, perfect stage like that. So, so as I said at the beginning, really for all of us, you know, there's all the kind of specific stuff and the different stages that everybody goes through, but the principle is that we try to lead our lives with those 2 components. One is the component, obviously, of service, chanting Hare Krishna mantra, engaging in practical service for Krishna. And of course, no better way to do that than assist with the mission of Lord Chaitanya and Srila Prabhupada, that Srila Prabhupada has given us, particularly by the establishment of his Iskcon movement like that. So that's one side, engaging in that service. And then the other, on a personal level, is how we can lead our lives in a way that we're developing, we're gradually building detachment from, the comforts of this world, so that we're as better prepared and as well prepared as we possibly can be. And I guess in some of these, including today's verse and purport, there might be a sense that, you know, there's more of an onus on the wife than the husband. Somehow or another, you know, what the duty of the wife is, what she's expected to do. As we're reading in this, we haven't really read so much, certainly not in today's verse and purport, about what Dhritarashtra's duties are, etc. So I'll tell a story that Srila Prabhupada referenced, which you know, it's gives the sort of reflects on the other side, and how and we know from modern history also, even modern culture, and Prabhupada would also cite that as well, where he would say that behind every great man is a great woman like that. So it's teamwork, and it's a package like that. We all have our role and we all have our duties. But anyway, the story that Prabhupada would have referenced sometimes was a story about the great emperor Akbar, he was touring through his kingdom with his famous minister Birbal, and in one place they saw one man, a husband, and he was with his wife, and they were arguing, which again is a kind of very normal activity and practice between husband and wife. Actually, Srila Prabhupada used to say that. He says you never take arguments between husbands and wives seriously. You know, that's of course, you know, that's a general statement. There may well be cases where, you know, it's become so serious that, you know, it should be taken seriously, but just in general, you know. I remember, you know, actually there's many stories like this where you know, not with devotees, you know, although maybe with devotees as well, but just in general, where you might have a husband and wife who are arguing and fighting, and sometimes even it gets to that stage where the husband may even be physical with the wife or vice versa, but usually the husband being physical with the wife, and then somebody will intervene, you know, a stranger will intervene and because he thinks it's, you know, too heavy and too whatever. So in the case, say, where a husband is slapping his wife or something like that, a passerby will intervene and sort of try to stop the whole situation, and then they find themselves, you know, being chastised by the wife, actually, you know, for doing that. So I think that was Prabhupada's point, that, you know, as a general rule, you know, the husband and wife, you let them sort of sort it out for themselves, you know. But obviously, as I say, there can be cases where maybe intervention is the right thing. Anyway, so Emperor Akbar is with his minister, and they see this husband and wife, and they're arguing, and then you know, at one point the wife slaps the husband on the face. Small lady in comparison to the man. He was a big guy, but anyway, she was slapping him on the face, and the husband was tolerating that. You know, he didn't do anything in return, and the wife continued, not slapping him, but she continued, you know, chastising him and getting on his case and all that kind of thing. And the husband apparently then, you know, he was sort of accepting that and bowing his head and all of that kind of thing. So then the king, he asks Birbal, Akbar asks Birbal, well, why was the husband just sort of tolerating that and accepting that? You know, it looked pretty abusive to me. And Birbal then responded by sort of insulting Akbar. Prabhupada talks about this actually, but ministers and kings in Vedic times, and you even had it in certainly in medieval England. You had the concept of the court jester with the king. And often the role, of course, you know, I'm not so much sure of the Vedic times. I think maybe the kings were more, you know, more accepting of it. Maybe in medieval England, you needed to be more careful. But the idea was that so the court jester would have to be careful in his kind of criticisms. But the kind of function of that role that they were playing was that to ensure the king didn't lose the run of themselves and get carried away with all their wealth and power, and, you know, just become really obnoxious, I guess, you know. So the court jester, or in this case Birbal, it's kind of keeping their feet on the ground, you know. So they would sort of you know, get on their case and you know, yeah, that type of thing. So Birbal's response was along those lines when Akbar said, well, you know, why is he accepting all that? And Birbal's response was, well, because the men in your kingdom, they're all too much attached to their wives, you know, and they always surrender to them, you know. The men in your kingdom are essentially very weak, you know. So, so Akbar took that as a criticism of him. He said, oh, I don't believe that, you know, I'm not buying that, you know. And then Birbal then replied, said, yeah, it's true, and I can prove it. Just let me call all the husbands in this region together from the whole area, and have them gather here in one place, and then we'll see. So Akbar agreed. So then they were all called, you know, so I'm not sure how many, but loads of men came, married men came into this open kind of area, and the king and Birbal were both there. And then Birbal said, you know, my dear citizens, you know, the great Emperor Akbar wants to know how many of you present here now, how many of you follow the commands of your wives? Without question, how many of you just follow them like that? So all of you who do, all of you who just, you know, blindly essentially follow the instructions of your wife, you should all move over to this side of this open space. So on the count of 3, either stay where you are or move over. So 1, 2, 3, and then all but one moved over. And Birbal said to Akbar, just see, you know. And then Birbal's response was, well, hang on a sec, one has stayed there, all but one moved over. There was one that stayed there. He says, all but one moved over, so, you know, that's something. So you're not 100% right. We have one good man like that. So then Birbal says, yeah, okay, point taken, but it is only one out of however many hundreds were there. And then Birbal said to the man who had stayed in the place, he says, when I asked people who obey the orders of their wives to all move over, everyone moved except you. Why did you stay where you are? And he says, oh, because my wife has told me to avoid crowds. Yeah, so that was a story that Prabhupada liked to tell sometimes. So yeah, I think I will stop there. Yes, at 8:23 I will stop there. But basically, I mean, the message of the verse and purport today is very clear, that, you know, man, woman, you know, grihastha, sannyasi, you know, kshatriya, vaishya, whatever it may be, that, you know, ultimately we're all in the same boat, and that is the boat of this material world. And while we can gain strength from encouraging each other, as Vidura was giving strength to Dhritarashtra here by getting him to leave home, and how Gandhari was getting so much strength from being the ideal wife and following her husband like that. And we can get strength here through association. Prabhupada also gives that really nice example that you have a flock of birds and they're all flying in one direction. Usually they fly in that kind of arrow formation. You have one at the lead like that, and then all the others coming back. And they take turns to lead, because that's the hardest place to be, because you're taking the full force of the wind that you're flying into, and it's more tiring. Cyclists do that as well, actually. So they take turns rotating like that. And through that formation, they get strength through that association, and that's where the phrase comes from, birds of a feather flock together. And so Prabhupada will give that example, but then he would also make the point, but ultimately we also have to fly. It's not that we can just be in that formation and not flap our wings. If we don't flap our wings, we will immediately fall from the sky like that. So it's a combination of the association of devotees, sadhu sangha. So we get strength from that. From these gatherings now in COVID times, with Zoom, they're on Zoom rather than in person, but basically we're discussing the philosophy of Krishna consciousness and the great pastimes of the great devotees in Srimad Bhagavatam, etc. So we get great strength from that. At the same time, we also have to contribute, and do as much as we can on our own efforts and our own strength like that. And that combination of us endeavouring as best as we can in the association of devotees and getting protection and shelter and inspiration from that association, then our road back to Godhead is clear, and we ultimately will achieve that. Okay, thank you all very much. Until next week, I guess. Hare Krishna. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Srila